Hello, and welcome to our fourth session of our LGBT Inclusion in the Episcopal Church series. And in this final wrap-up session, I'm just going to be reflecting briefly on the strength and the giftedness of this place where we have come as a denomination after many years of discerning and of struggle. So in the previous videos, we already talked about that history and about scripture interpretation, some of the hurdles there that we've talked and dealt with, as well as looking at queer theology as a particular lens. And I wanted to do that partly to kind of begin to break open the idea of specifically the giftedness, the blessing that comes when we're able to as we have been able to embrace inclusion as a denomination. So a lot has been sort of written and reflected on since 2003 on the division and on the pain that's happened in our denomination, as well as throughout the Anglican Communion, because of our decision to embrace inclusion. And I think I don't want to gloss over that lightly. I do want to say that I understand and I recognize the pain that is there, which is very real. Individual churches have been torn apart. Communities experiencing a pain, which is my own actually church that I was baptized in and grew up in as a child, split. They were part of a diocese which split from the Episcopal Church, and so each congregation then had to decide who would stay with the denomination and who would leave. And then they had a long property battle over the church, and I remember thinking at the time, it's like a divorce, except it's much messier because it's a whole community that's involved. It's not just a family, but so many families, and the way that all of those relationships have developed over many years. So the pain is absolutely there. I do want to recognize that. And of course, in the Anglican Communion, there's been pain and difficulty, especially in places in the world where it's not safe, or where it's illegal to be in a same-sex relationship. In places like that, the fact that Anglican churches there are associated with us, and that our stance on inclusion is well known in the news in other parts of the world as well. People have suffered violence at the hands of others, people who might not even agree with us in terms of our inclusive stance, but because of their relationship with us, have been targeted, and that is tremendously painful. But I also want to say, and I should say not but, and the communion is still hanging together, the Anglican Communion. And this is after since 2003. So almost 20 years of people predicting that there was no way that we could stay in a relationship, that there was no way that we could grow past this, that this was the end of the communion, that the Episcopal Church would be cut out, would be ejected from the communion. And that did not happen. We sort of had our wrists slapped, if you will, a few times. We had people that were removed from commissions and things like that. But we weren't kicked out. And I think that there has been a movement because of this difficult issue, because of the fact that we've had to talk to each other when we disagree, that has led to deeper relationship and deeper conversation than would have happened otherwise. And certainly it also led to broken relationships. But in my experience in the Anglican Communion, it has led to a real awareness and realization, perhaps, among those in the American church that we value these international relationships that we have, and a desire to be real, to be deep, to connect with one another, to try to understand each other's positions, even though we disagree, and to come to a place of recognizing each other's belovedness, each other's humanity, and the call that we have to walk together in Christ, even though we may be walking in slightly different directions. And I think there's tremendous value there. I would be interested to see how many more, just if there were any data that we could look at in terms of how many more relationships there are now, than before. And I would expect there to be more. My own personal experience of talking with churches and people is that is that there's more engagement with the rest of the world now than there was before. The other thing is that the Anglican Communion has met us in some ways and reached out an arm and a hand in a way that I didn't expect. So the Lambeth Conference, which happens every 10 years, is where all the bishops from around the Anglican Communion get together. And it's the one meeting. An invitation to Lambeth means you're a part of the Anglican Communion, an invitation from the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I think I talked in a previous session how we're a strangely organized worldwide denomination because we are held together not by an authority structure, but by bonds of affection. That's the official term. A relationship is what holds the Anglican Communion together, a common practice of worship, a history, and specifically relationship. And so the Anglican Communion can only hold together when it's real people having real relationships with one another. So the Lambeth Conference was held on the 8th year of every decade for I don't know how many hundreds of years. And they delayed it by 2 years to give them more time to plan for what they called Lambeth 2020, in which they were kind of trying to find a compromise, trying to find a way that these different churches with different ideas could come together, study scripture together, and continue to build relationship together. And of course, because of the pandemic, it's now been pushed off to 2022. So a little bit even further out. But invitations were issued to Lambeth Conference to LGBTQ bishops in the Episcopal Church as well as the Anglican Church in Canada, and that's a first. The previous Lambeth, Gene Robinson, was barred from participating. He was not invited. He was I believe the only openly LGBT bishop in our church at the time. So this honestly is a step forward and a reaching out that I didn't expect, because they had been so kind of staunchly limiting previously. So I think that's a really hopeful sign. But I also think that it's a really hopeful sign that honestly, as much as I love the Anglican Communion, we don't need the structure in order to affirm the relationships. It certainly helps in making relationships. But regardless of what is happening between national church bodies, the people on the ground are building relationships more and more. And our church, we are blessed with a wonderful relationship that's just developed during the pandemic, entirely on Zoom, with a church in Epping, which is just at the north end of London, and a church in New York City, a Church of the Heavenly Rest, a church in Brazil, St. Luke's, Rio de Janeiro, and the Diocese of Jerusalem, a group of clergy and young adult leaders from the Diocese of Jerusalem as well. And we've gotten to become friends and do Bible studies together, all on Zoom. So I think it's just one small example of the way in which I am confident and passionately confident that actually you can see I didn't even do this on purpose, but that's the Anglican Communion map on my office wall there with each one of the participating church bodies, international church bodies, highlighted in a different color. So I'm a passionate believer in the importance of the Anglican Communion, but also a believer in the fact that Christ connects us to one another, and that regardless of what happens and what discussions and arguments are happening between international church bodies, that relationships will continue to flourish as the Spirit calls us to be real with one another, to encounter each other, and to learn and to grow. So I think that's happened and become more rich and more deep more quickly because of this struggle and disagreement that we've had in the communion around inclusion. So that's one benefit of this hard time that I've seen. And if we look then to the other direction, to think about in our own church experience, but both individual churches, but also as the Episcopal Church, which is the United States, as well as churches in Europe, Haiti, Taiwan, other countries. There are 16 countries that are part of our church, which is led currently by our presiding bishop, Michael Curry. And I think that as we talked about in the history, the talk on history, we saw the way in which the church made little steps forward, and the way in which our inclusion of women and our inclusion of LGBT folks was kind of woven in and out together, as we made steps toward inclusion, and really some bold statements even in the 1970s about inclusion. But that it was sort of like one little step at a time and a sort of a half step. And part of the reason why that was, I think, is because the church has tried in many different ways in changes that we've taken on to include people, that might disagree, and to bring them along slowly, to make space for them. But similarly to the inclusion of women, there came a point where the church finally said, look, we've got to fully commit to this. We can no longer kind of let people choose yes or no. We came to the same place with LGBT inclusion. So while the church is an open and welcoming place for people who disagree theologically with us, we would never kick anyone out or say that they don't belong. We strongly make safe space for people who have been hurt by other denominations and by other places, to feel welcomed, and to understand that we as a denomination stand for inclusion. And we also stand for, not just within our church, but in the wider society. So we are strongly making stances against discrimination based on race, sexuality, gender expression, any kind of age, any kind of discrimination there is. That we stand strongly against that. And not only do we kind of make resolutions about that every 3 years when we get together for a legislative assembly, but we also work. We work in community organizing. We work in ministries. We make statements and write editorials and all sorts of things, as individuals and as churches and as church bodies, to make our position known, and so that we can let people know that we need to be at least as loud as the people that are saying that LGBT inclusion is not right, or that it's against God's will. So that people know that to be Christian does not just mean one thing. And unfortunately, so often in the news, at least in the US, the people that get the microphone and are kind of put on the news are people who are shouting hateful things. And so I think that this struggle for inclusion in the church has really helped raise the profile of the Episcopal Church in our nation, because we've gotten out there and we've talked and we've said what we believe, and we've done these things in a public way, and that's been great for us. There are several denominations, I think, who used to be known as the frozen chosen, and we were one of them. That joking phrase, but the idea was there that we were afraid to talk. Perhaps that was the stereotype: afraid to talk about our faith or the way we saw God at work in the world, and really having to discern and to struggle as a community, and to come to a place of majority opinion on this, and to move forward, was to really test our voices and to test our ability to live into what it was that we were feeling like God was calling us to do. And that has helped us and made us stronger, and strengthened our sort of activism muscles, if you will, to make us ready for whatever comes in the future and whatever is happening now. So the Episcopal Church right now, under the leadership of Bishop Curry and many wonderful staff members in his office, have wonderful racial reconciliation resources available to us, and so many parishes and individuals are getting involved in that, learning and looking at what that means in our in the living of our daily lives. How it is that we can be a part of healing and of reconciliation. And I think that we are better suited for that work because we have spent these 2 decades or more really wrestling with who it is that God is calling us to be. So I think we come to this place as a church which is more visible than it used to be, in more known for its stances than it used to be. And also, if you will, a bit of a pioneer in this. We weren't the first denomination, but we were among the first major kind of mainstream Protestant denominations to really have this conversation in a public way and publicly come out and say, this is who we are and this is what we support. And because of that, I think that we've made it a little bit easier for others to follow in our footsteps. We've made it every other denomination is going to have that discussion. It's a part of the reality of the way it is of what's happening in our communities and in our societies and the broader understanding of humanity and sexuality. And so they're going to have that conversation. And so I feel like we provide a gift for those who are coming along after us in this conversation. And certainly the conversation will happen in different ways in every group of people, and it will happen in different ways at different moments in time, as well as new. Each moment is a different context. But I think that we have provided some resources for others to look to us and to say, yeah, this is scary, but they came through this all right. Yes, they had more than a decade of legal battles. Yes, they had all kinds of issues and struggles, but they came out of it, and they came out of it with these blessings and with this sense of wholeness that they didn't have before. So I'm really thankful for that. I'm really proud of our denomination for that. I'm really pleased to get to be a part of that story and of that future. And I think that we've also gained a lot of new members to the Episcopal Church because of this. When I was visiting my home church, the one that the church that I grew up in, that I was mentioning to you, I visited them during the time when the folks who were wanting to remain Episcopal could no longer meet in their church building. And they had been meeting at a school for a time. And it was in the news that they were meeting at a school. And the synagogue in town took them in. And one of the reasons they gave was, they said, before we built our building, you welcomed us into your building and we worshiped in your parish hall for the Sabbath every week. And then we built our building, but we remember that time when you showed us hospitality. And so they said, we want to return that favor. And you can use our sanctuary on Sundays when we don't use it. And we can find a way together. And it was one of the most just joyful, beautiful worship services that I had experienced in that community when I joined them at the synagogue to pray and to worship together. And it just reminded me that there were folks in the congregation that I met who I'd never seen before. And they said, we came because we saw in the news that there was a church meeting at the synagogue, and we wanted to know, well, that seemed really amazing that would happen. And we wanted to know more. And the more that we found out about who you are and why this had come to be, the more we wanted to be part of it. So, it's not all about growth. I'm firmly a believer in the fact that God calls us, whether we are 12 in number or 2 million in number. God calls us to follow and to be true to our calling. But it is a joyful thing, because with every new person that joins a church, that church is changed, and that church has a little more of a perspective in a different direction. And that's one of the beautiful things about diversity. And I think that's the thing that I'll close with, the idea of diversity and how that makes us who we are, because each one of us reacts to and engages with and follows God and experiences God in our own way. And when we come from more diverse backgrounds and perspectives, from different sexualities, different gender expressions, different backgrounds, different education levels, different countries and languages of origin, the more difference that we have, when we're able to really meet one another, to meet God in each other, the more full picture we get of who it is that God is, because humanity is made in the image of God, each and every one of us a beloved child of God. And so if we just stick with people who are the most like us, we can only know one small aspect of who God is. And what we have learned as the Episcopal Church, because of our stance on inclusion, because of this struggle that we have been through, is that God's love is for everyone, and that we are called to throw wide the doors of our church and the doors of our hearts in order that we might be challenged, be stretched, and grow and meet God in each other.